Hey there, amazing friends. I warmly invite you to join me on this exciting journey by subscribing to my channel, liking, commenting, and sharing my videos. Every like, comment, and share brings us closer together and fuels my passion to create more great content. Your support truly makes all the difference. Thank you for being the heart of this community. The Forgotten Castle Beyond the Shadow. The silent lament of walls that devour even themselves. In the far reaches of a land seldom mapped, beyond a ragged horizon of jagged peaks and a valley perpetually swathed in twilight, there stands a castle seldom visited and scarcely spoken of. The locals, in the few scattered hamlets that lie miles away, refer to it only in hushed caution, using vague hand gestures to ward off its memory. They call it the Castle Beyond the Shadow. From a distance, one sees only a slender outline of its turrets and ramparts against a sky that perpetually smolders in dusky hues. Closer inspection is nearly impossible, for it is said the roads leading there shift or vanish altogether, as though the terrain itself keeps the curious at bay. Legends say the castle's dark silhouette merges with the twilight so completely that it seems not so much anchored to the ground, but floating in a dimension suspended between day and night. And yet, despite all attempts to remain hidden, it beckons to certain wanderers, especially those with a spark of morbid curiosity or desperation that leads them astray from safer routes. If one perseveres down those winding paths, stepping deeper into the gloom where even birdsong recedes to a dead hush, that is where the ancient fortress reveals itself. Its black stone walls exude an air of silent despair, as though centuries of unspoken sorrow have seeped into every crack. But the closer you come, the more you sense an inexplicable reversal of life's normal rules. The walls seem to shift in subtle, disquieting ways, as if they are devouring themselves in slow motion. At times, a chunk of stone along the ramparts appears not chipped by age, but as though physically swallowed from within. This is the first sign that the forgotten castle beyond the shadow is no normal ruin. Travelers who turn back at that initial glimpse might only feel mild relief and an intangible dread. But for those who dare approach the ancient drawbridge, often found broken, yet somehow passable at certain hours, there awaits a realm of unrelenting night. The castle courtyard, once presumably paved with cobblestones and arranged with stables and storehouses, now stands awash in an eerie hush, strewn with collapsed beams and rotted crates. Overhead, tattered banners still cling to rusted poles, their colors drained by uncounted storms. The silence has a weight to it, pressing against the eardrums, as though the very air is heavy with the resonance of half-remembered laments. A few timid explorers who ventured this far noted how their voices died swiftly when they tried to speak, swallowed by the gloom, as if the space itself abhorred conversation. Some swore they heard faint sighs or whispers rising from cracks in the stone floor, though no companion or source was present. Yet even those faint illusions pale in comparison to the strangeness that reveals itself when you examine the walls. If you watch carefully, you might catch a piece of masonry shift inward with a nearly imperceptible crunch, as if devoured by an unseen mouth. Another bit of stone might protrude further out, like regurgitated debris, then slowly reabsorb. The effect is so subtle that many explorers blame their eyes or the flicker of the waning sunlight. But those who remain long enough come to realize it's real. The castle is engaged in a cyclical process of consuming its own architecture, an endless silent lament symbolized by walls that erode from within, only to partially rebuild and then devour themselves anew. Legends about this phenomenon swirl in local folklore. One story recounts a tyrannical baron whose thirst for alchemical power led him to sign a black pact with an entity from beyond mortal ken, some nebulous shape that wandered in from the boundary of day and night. The pact supposedly granted the Baron near immortality within his domain, but in exchange, the castle's structure itself would come alive in a twisted mimicry of sentience. The devouring walls stand as the visible manifestation of that curse, slowly collapsing and regenerating in a tormenting cycle that traps the Baron's essence. Another story says it was not the Baron, but a line of cursed knights who tried to harness the twilight energies of the region, forging a massive fortress to hold monstrous abominations. This fortress then turned upon itself in an ironic punishment, ensuring that no mortal design would remain stable. Whether any of these are true or mere myth, the phenomenon in the stone is undeniable. Researchers or adventurers who have braved the fortress all come back shaken, telling how corridors twisted behind them in the gloom, or how a door that was open earlier became walled off by fresh layers of petrified stone an hour later. One man, said to be a traveling scholar of haunted architecture, vanished for 2 days inside the fortress, only to emerge pale and half-crazed, babbling about hallways that changed shape at night and rooms that tried to swallow him. He died soon after, his notes scrawled with references to devouring walls and the moan of stone. Yet this silent, creeping cannibalism of architecture is only the surface horror, because with it, the castle is said to lament. If one stands in a corridor after dusk, straining to hear, they may pick up faint groans as though the stones themselves cry out in protest at their entrapment. Some explorers claim that these moaning echoes hold a tragic melody reminiscent of a funeral dirge. Others say they convey a monstrous hunger, the castle's unstoppable desire to devour. But the effect is chilling either way. In the labyrinth of swirling passages, small glimmers of movement lurk at the edges of one's vision, a curtain drifting as if a figure just brushed by, or a shape that might be a statue, only to shift impossibly the moment you blink. Indeed, the castle, beyond devouring itself, is rumored to host ephemeral inhabitants, silhouettes that appear in upper windows or crouched in the corners of battered courtyards, often with an unearthly stillness. Are these ghosts of the Baron's court, illusions conjured by the castle's curse, or actual monsters that dwell in the trembling masonry? No consensus exists. The few times a visitor approached one of these silhouettes, it dissolved into swirling motes or receded behind a stone arch that soon vanished into a swirl of devouring stone. The watchers rarely risk pursuit, for each step deeper into the fortress ups the ante of disorientation and peril. One hallmark of the fortress environment is the constant gloom. Even in midday, the light within is a subdued twilight, as if the castle repels the sun's rays. Explorers might climb to a vantage point in a half-collapsed tower, expecting to see the countryside lit by noon. Instead, the sky above remains tinted in bruised color, the horizon lost in haze, and the interior of the courtyard steeped in perpetual shadow. It's as though the fortress abides in its own microclimate or a parallel dimension aligned with dusk. In the depths of night, that gloom intensifies to near blackness, relieved only by some faint phosphorescence that sometimes bleeds from cracks in the walls. The phosphorescence is rumored to be the residue of the Baron's alchemical experiments, or the manifested presence of something older and less definable. Approaching it can yield sensations of heaviness or dread. Some claim to see flickering shapes in the swirling glow, mocking silhouettes of faces or chanting robed figures. Others, more sober-minded, guess it's a kind of bioluminescent fungus that has colonized the stone. Yet the fungus explanation hardly accounts for the swirling patterns or the sense of a living design that emerges at intervals. Local rumor also holds that beyond the main keep and the labyrinthine corridors, somewhere in the fortress' deepest recesses, lies a heart or core chamber. The Baron or Knights were said to have anchored the central focus of their cursed pact there, forging a literal beating heart for the castle out of twisted magic. The moans that echo throughout the fortress might, in truth, be emanating from this heart chamber, each lamentation resonating outward through living stone. If that is the case, it suggests that the walls devouring themselves is a result of a cyclical pulse from that core, each wave of unnatural energy rearranging the architecture in slow but unstoppable transformations. Some have tried to find the chamber, presumably to sever the curse and free the land from the fortress' malignant influence. But no confirmed account states they succeeded in discovering it. One old legend says a disguised wandering monk made it as far as a door of pure black iron deep beneath the ground, only to sense a dreadful presence behind it. The monk scrawled notes about hearing a wet pounding, like an organic heartbeat, followed by the sensation that the floor was melting underfoot. He fled upward, nearly trapped by corridors that had rearranged themselves behind him. He emerged battered and half-lucid, muttering about how the fortress was not a building, but an organism, and that the door might be the threshold to its monstrous central organ. But in this labyrinth of horrors, the scariest fact remains the fortress' capacity to devour not only itself, but also intruders. Disappearances are common enough that local farmers or herdsmen keep their flocks far from the estate's shadow. Tales abound of travelers who sought shelter from storms in the fortress' outer halls. They never re-emerged. Later, their footprints or scattered belongings turned up near a corridor wall that didn't exist a day before. Some items were half embedded in stone, as though the structure had grown around them. The implication is that the devouring walls can seize more than mere masonry. A vanish of any living being stands as a potential offering to the labyrinth. The question is, do these vanishings feed something, or do they simply reflect a bizarre cosmic anomaly in the fortress architecture? The region's wise or superstitious avoid investigating. They have enough cautionary stories to realize that a short glimpse from afar is all they ever want to experience. As the gloom of dusk seeps in each evening, one can stand on a distant hill and see the fortress in partial silhouette, hearing, if the wind is still, the faint groaning of shifting walls. Over the centuries, that moaning became known as the Lament of the castle. Some nights it is low and rhythmic, as though the fortress breathes. On others, it rises to a shriek-like crescendo that sets wolves howling in the distant forest. In certain seasons, that lament is eerily silent, fueling speculation that the castle might be sleeping, hoarding energy for its next feast. Yet, inevitably, the moans return, accompanied by illusions of lights flickering behind arrow slits or a swirl of vapor above collapsed turrets. For certain esoteric scholars, the phenomenon is a prime candidate for study. But the region has no major academic institutions, and the risk of traveling to a place so overshadowed by monstrous rumor is too high for most. Only the occasional rogue adventurer with more curiosity than caution sets forth, typically returning with wild-eyed tales of hallways that bend at impossible angles and walls that subtly ripple like water. Traces of older times still remain amid the fortress gloom. One might discover a banquet hall, half roofless, featuring a grand table rotted and collapsed, but still suggestive of the feasts once held there. Oddly, no bones or remains appear in that space, either stolen by time or devoured by the structure. Tattered tapestries cling to the walls, their designs indecipherable, but seemingly depicting half-human creatures merging with swirling architecture. Another walkway leads to a dilapidated library, shelves slanted from the shifting floor. Most volumes are reduced to moldy lumps, but if one rummages carefully, they might find scraps of a bestiary describing impossible beasts. In the margin notes, references appear to a devourer locus, possibly describing the living architecture. So many fragments, so few coherent explanations. Another area rumored to exist is a hidden armory containing weapons once used by the fortress guardians. Some believe these weapons were forged with runes or inscriptions meant to subdue the fortress if it turned rebellious. Whether that's real or a legend is unknown. The fortress' shifting geometry likely hides or reveals that armory at whim, ensuring that if such weapons exist, they remain out of mortal reach. One noteworthy tale recounts the fate of a traveling minstrel who, out of naive boldness, decided to wander the fortress for inspiration. The minstrel's journal, recovered from a local shop, ends abruptly. In the last entry, the minstrel writes, "The walls move in my peripheral vision. I feel them breathe. Hallways that once led me forward now curve back upon themselves. My lute strings vibrate with no hand plucking them, as if the fortress has found a voice through my instruments. I can sense something feeding on my fear, bending the corridors to keep me lost. The moans from the stone. It's like each block begs for release from this torment. I caught a reflection in a broken mirror, a shape behind me, faceless, reaching out. Then it was gone, swallowed by the shifting stone. If tomorrow I can find a path out, I shall never return. Gods preserve my soul. The minstrel was never found. The journal's pages were discovered stuffed under a rock near the outer gate, presumably left behind in one last attempt to share a warning or a farewell. That act of writing down final impressions recurs across multiple discovered diaries and scraps. People sense the unstoppable approach of doom within those twisting corridors and try to leave behind a record. Each record resonates with the same impression. A malevolent yet weary presence saturates the fortress, as though it regrets its compulsion to devour, but cannot cease. If the occupant is an ancient curse or entity, it might be imprisoned in a cycle of hunger and self-consumption, dragged along by cosmic inertia. The unstoppable aspect makes the fortress a unique form of living imprisonment, both for itself and for any soul that wanders in. The stories converge on one conclusion. The castle is a place of no easy exorcism or redemption. That is why it stands, half forgotten, overshadowed by perpetual twilight. The land around it, even the sun overhead, seems to have surrendered. The name Castle Beyond the Shadow suits it, a domain of half-light and lingering gloom, locked in unending lament that devours not just its walls, but the hopes of anyone crossing its threshold. It is possible that someday, a perfect alignment of circumstances might let the fortress devour itself entirely, crumbling into dust. Yet legends imply the fortress can reassemble. Some corners have been said to vanish in a quake, only for them to reappear days later, perhaps reconfigured. In that sense, it is arguably immortal. The land itself, powerless against it, has withdrawn, leaving the fortress in a vacuum of fear. For those outside the region, the entire saga might sound like a feverish fiction. They might dismiss the rumored moans as atmospheric illusions, the self-devouring walls as illusions of collapse. Yet the consistent threads across centuries of testimony challenge easy denial. Even the most skeptical travelers, upon gazing at the fortress from a distance, find themselves unsettled by a subtle shift in the structure's silhouette. The logical mind insists it's a trick of the light. The primal instincts sense more, a living malevolence. In whispered circles beyond the region, a trickle of so-called dark tourists occasionally plan an expedition. Some come back shaken, changed by the intangible sense that they confronted a dimension of horror that dwarfs typical ghost stories. Others do not return, fueling the fortress myth. Meanwhile, the local community mostly coexists with it by ignoring it. Their daily lives revolve around farmland, small trades, or local festivals, overshadowed by a constant knowledge that to the north or east, depending on vantage, lurks a region lost to perpetual twilight, crowned by that silent abomination. In final reflection, the forgotten castle beyond the shadow, the silent lament of walls that devour even themselves, is more than an architectural oddity. It stands as a testament to how curses, misguided experiments, or arcane bargains can twist the boundaries between life and stone. The fortress transcends mortal logic, reflecting an unstoppable cycle of self-consumption. In that cyclical devouring, the fortress moans as if it, too, yearns for release from a cosmic error. Meanwhile, any intruder who stumbles inside becomes fodder for the labyrinth's hunger, whether physically or psychologically devoured. The devouring walls close in, or the occupant's intangible presence entraps them in endless corridors. Either way, their story merges into the fortress lament. The approach of night intensifies everything, forging a realm of hushed terror where each footstep might trigger a ripple in the living masonry. So if ever you find yourself in that dark region and the sky turns bruised purple by the time you approach an ancient stone silhouette rising from the horizon, heed the warnings. If your feet itch to see inside, remember that countless others tried and lost themselves in shifting gloom. For the moaning fortress stands as a silent sentinel, exhaling a sorrow older than any kingdom's fall. Its devouring walls assure that no curiosity can stand unpunished. In the labyrinth of corridors, no matter how bright your torch, the gloom prevails. And if you linger near midnight, the ramparts may tremble with a hush too thick to be natural, the intangible echo of centuries, culminating in a moan from the stone itself, like a cry for an impossible salvation. In that moment, you might see a portion of wall pulse inward, as if swallowed by an invisible maw. Your heart might jolt with the realization that you are inside a living nightmare, a place that hungers for your presence. If you are wise, you'll retreat, never to return. If not, your footsteps might join the uncounted echoes, your final breath lost in the castle's silent lament as the living stone encloses around you, sealing your fate in a gloom that devours everything, including itself.